Hey folks, I'm Tina. I'm from Canada and I'm highly jet lagged, so apologies if I lose the plot as we go. The piece that I'm doing today is I'm going to be talking about teaching place in settler Canada, which is taking a look at popular undergraduate textbooks that are used in Canadian social work education. And maybe this will work. Does it work? It did work. I did.
I just one click on it, and then for
There you go. What did you touch?
I just needed to go back to it. Like now it works.
Okay. Thank you, Brina. As you probably know or probably familiar, when people from the major settler colonies travel abroad, we often do what gets called a land acknowledgement in the Canadian context or the American context. So there's I would say, or I'd frame this as there's different pressures on social work in the settler colonies like Canada to think about place and land. There's different pressures on us because of Indigenous settler relations and the politics of Indigenous settler relations in places like Canada, Australia, in the United States. And so one of the sort of highly political acknowledgements of place is something that gets called a land acknowledgement in Canada, and they're common elsewhere as well. And these are, so every single university in Canada has an official sort of sanctioned by the university, reviewed by the legal team, approved for media use, land acknowledgement of whose land we're on. And so this is the official land acknowledgement for the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus and from the university. So it says the campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. Unceded means these lands were never sold, traded, or given up through treaty or other agreement. We honor, celebrate, and thank the Musqueam peoples on whose territory the campus has the privilege to be situated. The Musqueam peoples have been stewards and caretakers of this territory since time immemorial. And to acknowledge and support this important role, UBC strives towards building meaningful, reciprocal, and mutually beneficial partnerships with the Musqueam peoples. So if you're interested in how Musqueam represents themselves, there's a link up on the slide. So this is like a hugely fraught politics with this sort of thing. And on the settler side, so the university side and me is the settler side, is this like beautiful acknowledgement of colonial history. And these land acknowledgements they're interesting points of tension because UBC is one of the most wealthy universities in the country. It's on unceded territory, and the vast majority of the wealth of the university is actually based in real estate. So there's this kind of acknowledgement of those settler Indigenous relations, while also sort of the standard sort of capitalist and land ownership stuff. It still happens. So this kind of thing is super fraught in Canada. The map that's up on the slide right now is actually, it's a map of the treaties between Indigenous peoples and the two major settler governments, the Canada and the United States. So I'll just have a series of different maps sort of running in the background on this talk, because there's many different ways to think about space and place, and from the sort of the settler side or the Indigenous side, and the regional sort of distribution of stuff in North America. I'll give you a little bit of a sort of a background or the context for how social work in Canada is turning towards place, towards environment or considerations. And the larger politics of the project that I'm working on. And then I'll sort of nod more specifically to what I'm talking about today in terms of thinking about place, thinking about textbooks as a source of or a site of research or investigation, and also as a site of a sort of corrective or an intervention in social work. I'll actually move into actually sort of talking to some of my tentative conclusions, because this project is far from over. It's very much at the beginning stages. And then based on time, I'll go through some examples from the textbooks of what I'm talking about. So for context, So the settler state of Canada is just under 160 years old. So we were, Confederation was in 1867. Social work's about 100 years old in Canada, professional social work. Depending on when you want to start the clock, there's different ways of sort of counting it, but we're roughly 100 years old. So the development of the nation state, the development of the welfare state, and the development of the profession of social work are very closely tied in Canada. And they have always sort of been in a sort of a relationship that influences each other in really sort of obvious ways. So in the recent history, in 2015, you might have heard of it, you might not have if you don't pay attention to the Canadian politics, but there's something that gets called the TRCC report, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. And so this was a major document written by Indigenous peoples on a sovereign basis, and speaking from sovereignty to sovereignty. So from Indigenous peoples to the settler government, making very specific demands about what gets called truth and reconciliation, which is the process of acknowledging the historical and contemporary harms of colonization for Indigenous peoples, and making really, really widespread demands for change in how government operates, how education at every single level in Canada works, so public education as well as university education, how professions like social work and healthcare are educated, the stories that we get told about Indigenous peoples, the standard education, and then also massive challenges to property law, which is land law often. So huge challenges from 2015, so it's less than 10 years old. And at the same time that the same year that the TRCC report came out, we got a new federal level government. So we got a liberal, this is Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, the liberal government in Canada. And it's a much more sort of social investment style approach to social policy, much more on the sort of democratic liberal side of things. So very, very performative around equity stuff, which meant that the Liberals took up the TRCC report in ways that a conservative government might not have. So anyway, so that's 2015, lots of stuff, lots of sudden movement in social policy, as well as Indigenous sovereignty in Canada. In social work proper, we got a new, our education, social work education, there's a federal level accreditation body that standardizes what has to be taught in social work education in Canada. So we got a new standard of accreditation, and it put the natural environment as a top level learning outcome for all social work education in Canada. So that happened in 2021. And then we actually just got a new code of ethics for the first time in 20 years. The last one was in 2025. So just in January, we got a new code of ethics for social work, and it adds truth and reconciliation as a top line item for the code of ethics in Canada, where it has historically not been on the code at all. And it adds explicit text around the environment as a subclause under the top level code, clause of around social justice. So there's big movements and big sort of infrastructural movements in Canada around indigenizing, decolonizing, Indigenous sovereignty, but also place and land and environment. This is some of the context for this. So I'm doing not anything related to the More Than Human research project that is trying to look at in sort of the historical development of social work and the welfare state in Canada, and the development of social work imaginaries in Canada, how the social and the environment were treated as separate things, and as a kind of corrective to try to do a better job in social work in thinking of more than human questions. So I'm doing some work to look at the published historiography on social work in Canada, some stuff around formal ethics, and then the piece that I'm talking about today is representations of the environment in our textbooks. So this is the larger project, but it's meant as a sort of intervention into discourse in social work in Canada around sort of more than human topics, even though the methods are not more than human at all. So that's the background. In terms of textbook research, I had never actually looked at textbook research before I started working on this, but it is actually its own field of study. And intervention in textbooks, so researching into what's the contents of textbooks and then correcting textbooks is big in the national education scene, but also within disciplines. And so textbooks function to some extent of the voices of disciplines. And so they have a key function as building blocks in the architecture of knowledge. So if you're trying to correct or shift sort of imagination, shift culture, these kinds of things, intervening in textbooks is one of the major ways to go as an intentional corrective. So there is actually a fair amount of research in textbooks. And there's actually textbook research in social work as well. Not surprisingly, most of it comes from the United States. And most of our work on research or research into textbooks looks at the sort of if like a desired topic, like, I don't know, trauma-informed, whatever, or attachment, these kinds of topics, if they're included in our textbooks or not. When there's major changes to the national curriculum or state policy, folks will look at the textbooks to see if there's a match. And then sort of things like changing demographics, like an aging population. There's a few pieces that look at sort of the overall ideology or paradigms that are included in textbooks. And at least from the work that I've done so far to look at the research, I haven't found anything that looks at environment, land, time, space, or place. Interesting stuff. So because I'm working on this sort of larger project about the relation between the social and the environmental in the historical development of the welfare state in Canada, I went in with that sort of general approach to these textbooks. But then when I started actually reading the textbooks, and I'll tell you how I got there in a second, but when I started actually reading them, the nationalism that's sort of baked into the textbooks was really, really overt. Yeah, I was really struck by the stories or the narratives, the general sort of narrative in our textbooks. And it doesn't resonate with the Canada that I know at all, or very little of it anyway. So my question was actually like, what place is this? Like, what are we actually representing when we're teaching undergraduate students or new social workers? So, you know, what place are we teaching? It ended up being the question that I was thinking about for this particular talk, even though it's related to this larger project. And so in terms of sort of some of the sort of theoretical background, again, this is not, I think a lot with more than human thought, but this is not, the methods of this are not more than human at all. But I think a lot with Benedict Anderson's work on imagined communities. And there's a related concept from Edward Said in his book on Orientalism around imagined geographies. So if you're unfamiliar with Benedict Anderson on imagined communities, his big argument was that the advent of the printing press allowed for narratives, the same narrative, to be shared over time and space. And then because people are reading the same narrative over time and space, it sort of evokes a sense of an us that shares similar knowledge or similar temporality. And this us is an imagined community. So that's Benedict Anderson's. There's a huge literature on that if you're interested. And then Edward Said's work on imagined geographies is quite similar. And again, this is about representations, which is not a very more than human thing. This is a very sort of postmodern thing as representations. But Edward Said's work was around looking at the ways in which perceptions, articulations of places and landscapes and peoples express the politics, power, and desire of whoever's doing the articulation. So there's standpoint built into representations. And so Edward Said's work was on Orientalism, so it's very much sort of the West and the rest. But there's also internal forms of imagined geography where, which is typically forms of nationalism, where the political elite in a country will try to articulate a sense of space and a sense of place to evoke one of these kinds of imagined communities or an us that understands ourselves in location to place and space. So these are just some of the ideas that I'm in a really preliminary way thinking with as I read and reread these textbooks for how this kind of stuff shows up in social work. It's a fairly standard, straightforward project. I went through a standard process to identify the most popular textbooks. I identified the 6 most popular textbooks, and I'm in the process of going through a comparative qualitative content analysis. So standard research methods, nothing exciting. These are them. This is standard education in Canada. We have introduction to social work textbooks. We have introduction to the welfare state and the policy context kind of textbooks. And then I don't know if you know much about Canada, but we are incredibly vocal around stuff around social justice, equity, inclusion, power and privilege, anti-oppression. So we have those kinds of introductory textbooks as well. But I'm just going to be talking actually about these two textbooks right here. So these are our introduction to social work textbooks. So this is our first one. I'm not sure how it is in other countries. I'd be curious to hear. But our textbooks are really old. A lot of them are quite old. So this one's actually more than 20 years old. The first edition came out in 2002, and the most recent one last year. I don't know, again, if you don't know too much about Canada, but we have two official languages. We're English and French. English is the dominant language and French is the minority language. So these authors, they're located in Ontario, BC. So this is what gets called English Canada. So this is the Anglophone textbook. The general narrative of this one is state-anchored left political economy. It includes a very specific and very common periodization that gets repeated in Canada around sort of the 19th century as a period of colonial struggle that moved or transitioned into sort of civic and democratic progress and modernization. With after the World War II, you get the golden age of the welfare state is another common narrative in Canada. And then the loss of neoliberalism in the late 70s into the 80s. And then in 2015, we got the Liberal Party. And so there's a tentative hope that social policy is changing in Canada. So it's a really standard narrative. I didn't actually have this when I was in social work education. This wasn't the textbook that I used, but this periodization is just absolutely standard. And it's been standard for more than 20 years. So this is our left textbook in Canada. Here's our liberal textbook. So this one is newer. The first edition was from 2015, and then this one's from 2020. The location of these authors, this is so Canadian. So these guys are in Quebec, which is our French language province, but they're at an English university in the French language province. And the first author is actually American. They're from the United States. So again, this is very Canadian. This kind of composition is very Canadian. In the general narrative of this textbook, it could literally have been written by the Trudeau government in terms of like a sort of a liberal, we're very nice people kind of soundbite. So this is a liberal celebrate diversity narrative, which is very Canadian. And one of the things that's really interesting about this textbook is it explicitly claims to be a corrective to the Eurocentrism, again, a regional it's a regional contrast that gets used in Canada a lot, Eurocentrism. So the Hicks textbook, the other textbook, is Eurocentric, according to these authors. And so their corrective to the Eurocentrism of standard textbooks is to foreground Indigenous and French histories within the narratives that we teach in social work. And this corrective leads to a different kind of periodization. And so what these guys do is they give 4 pages to what they call different heritages or different traditions. So Indigenous folks get 4 pages, French language folks get 4 pages, and then English Canada gets 4 pages. And it's on almost a historical treatment of, they call it like cultural traditions of meeting human need. So it's not anchored in sort of the political economy, it's anchored in culture. And then they jump forward in these 3 different traditions or temporalities. They converge in the Great Depression, which is in the 1930s in Canada, in the advent of some of the major social policy levers in the welfare state in Canada. And then it follows a standard periodization, but stops in the 80s with neoliberalism, and then nothing happens after that. So this is your liberal textbook. So anyway, that's just the introduction of the 2 sort of texts that I'm working with. And so some of my initial impressions from reading these, and I'll give you examples in a second, there's a major conflation of geographic and social differences in our textbooks. So we talk a lot about things like English and French regions, which again, I was talking with Heather about this, where like the way that we use English in Canada would not fly in the UK. Like that would mean very different things in the UK. And similarly with French, actually. The textbooks all foreground the social impacts of place or land or things like climate. So one of the things with Canada is, one, it's a huge territory, like the land is massive, and the regional differences are quite stark. and a huge amount, at least historically, of labor was seasonal. So much of the impetus for the development of the welfare state was actually around maintaining a labor population in the off season. You absolutely had to, because if you wanted to still have labor when you could actually work, or you could actually work in resource extraction, typically, you had to maintain a sedentary population. So the social impacts of place get foregrounded, but they're behind the scenes, and the background is always this sort of climate or environment. There's really explicit sort of boat and train infrastructures, the organization of religion, and then organization of different classes of people in the history of Canada that gets written into these textbooks as different ways of sort of traveling and moving in the world. So you get named groups like Chinese railway workers, you get Black train porters, you get French orphan daughters of the king, who were arranged marriages. You get British home children, you get the Scottish Highlanders, and each of these groups has a different kind of mobility in the country as it gets written in these textbooks, in very brief. And people and place relationships are the most overt or stark when Indigenous peoples are being talked about. But in the main narrative of both of the texts, both the liberal and the left text, it tends to be it either romanticizes or risks romanticizing and reducing the relation between place and people to a cultural difference. So these are some of it. And the quote around placeless social science that comes from Agnew, the quote, the citations on the bottom of the slide. But this is around the development of the social sciences in North America was very much in relation with the development of the state. And so the state, as other folks today have been talking about, are very people oriented, work with very specific kinds of census categories, and are anchored to solving very specific predetermined understandings of social problems. So there's always the conflation of the geographic and the social in the North American context has always meant that sort of like notions of community get attended to, but notions of place don't in the social sciences in Canada. Anyway. So that's the same thing that I could definitely see in our textbooks. In terms of imagined geographies, there are, and this is like, I mean, Canada's the multicultural country. So it's in some ways that were really interesting because there's a lot going on and it's very contradictory all the time. And it's evident in our textbooks and a sort of the simplified sort of temporalities or groups that are represented in our textbooks. So the past in both of the textbooks, both liberal and left, the past is Europe. And so there's language of English and French ancestors. The past is also US, the USA, and the US's influence in terms of elite social reformers zigzagging over the border and sharing knowledges. Today in Canada, the story is that we are less violent and we're more generous than the United States, and that we're a good place to be a racialized newcomer. And I'll talk more about that in a second. In terms of imagined geographies and the way that Edward Said was thinking about them, and the kind of desires or standpoint that are written into representations of place. The left textbook, this is sort of classic, the sort of desire that's written into that textbook is around coaxing citizenship-based solidarity out of different peoples and regional differences that are quite stark in Canada, and to reaffirm the state as a protector of citizens from global capitalism. In contrast, you have the liberal textbook that is, and this is classic. This is Trudeau's government, but it's recognize, celebrate, move on, and prosper, with a little bit of a nod to the problems of neoliberalism. And one of the strategies in Canada is, even though there's sort of like a central or a mainstream textbook, the sort of multicultural recognition, the liberal social justice sort of discourse means that even though there's like textbooks that have been kicking around for 20 years, what the main authors will do is they'll invite Indigenous authors in to author the Indigenous chapter as a way of I mean, there is some sort of legitimate recognition there, but it's also a way of not taking responsibility for the discourse, I think. Anyway, so but in both of these textbooks, both the liberal and the left textbook, There's a very distinct sort of Indigenous standpoint that is quite different than the liberal and the left, and it is around truth and reconciliation. It's about sovereignty and very specifically about land back, which is about returning stolen land to Indigenous peoples, and about healing. So this is Canadian social work discourse in sort of writ large. This map is not from our textbooks. Well, actually, I think maybe there's one of them. I think the left textbook actually has a version of this in it. This is another representation of place, but this is rather than the political categories, either of the settler state or of the treaty arrangements between the settler state and Indigenous peoples. This is territory. This is Indigenous territories, and it's how people actually move or live or distribute over land. And this does not map onto the political categories of the nation state at all. Yeah, so it's a very different way of understanding place and land. And it tends to, Indigenous folks in North America tend to think of people in relation to climatic regions. So it's not the political categories of provinces or the nation state. It's about sort of the prairies or the coast or the forests or the Arctic. It's about climate rather than political categories. So I have like 5 minutes max left, so I'll just go through a few examples. So this is an image from the left textbook. And so this is your classic political economy story of social work in the welfare state in the settler context of Canada. And so there's no text that explains what this photo is, but my assumption would be that this is a photo of the Great Depression, and that these are unemployed workers at a soup kitchen. So this is your classic left political economy origin story for social work in the welfare state. I'll skip this one. Whereas the liberal textbook that is aiming to make a corrective on sort of the historical imagination of the profession in Canada, rather than beginning with mass unemployment in the Great Depression, they work with culture and tradition instead. And so the quote that's up on the slide is actually from this text down here. And it says, the foundations of social work in Canada can be represented as interwoven braids representing Indigenous French and English histories and contemporary approaches to social work practice and policy. So rather than starting with the political economy, it starts with culture, which is an interesting strategy. And just so you can hear sort of the Canadian discourse, I'll just jump to a small snapshot of this just in the interest of time, but it says, in chapter 1, we show how Indigenous French and English traditions have shaped and informed contemporary social work practice in Canada. Using the metaphor of a braid, we emphasize the unique ways in which these three traditions have been woven together to formulate and frame social work in Canada. In addition, we show how immigration has further contributed to the mosaic beauty and diversity that is Canada, compelling social workers to envision approaches to social work practice that reflect the myriad heritages of all who live in this country. So this is like the Canadian story of progress, and it is like the geopolitics, the ongoing conflict between different sort of groups, and particularly in this case, settlers and Indigenous folks are suppressed and turned into sort of the celebrate diversity discourse that's common in Canadian multiculturalism. I'm conscious of time. In general, there's very clear differences in capacity to move and differences in documented movement, depending on who you are in these textbooks. So the really overt one is that there's lots and lots of settler movement documented in the history chapters in these textbooks. And there's very specific regional allegiances, traditions, heritages. So this one just says the gradual shift from private charity work towards more social scientific method occurred more or less at the same time in Britain, the United States, and Canada. So scientific charity spread to most northeastern and midwestern large and medium-sized cities in the United States, and then from there to Canada. So there's this kind of movement that gets documented, and there's a really funny thing where we're like, there's in parentheses throughout all the textbook, there's like, we're not the United States. It's funny, the contrasts, the national contrasts, but I'll skip this one. But in terms of spatial relations, and I know that I'm on time, spatial relations, if there is settler movement, there is Indigenous confinement. And so this map is actually not from the textbooks. I pulled it from the Library of Congress. And this map it actually shows the extermination of the bison in North America. So you can see the migratory path that the bison used to take. And they're pretty much, they're not extinct, but they're pretty darn close to it. So the quote that's up on the slide comes from one of the textbooks, and this comes from Dr. Raven St. Clair, who's a very well-known Indigenous scholar and educator in social work in Canada. And so the quote from her is, "Decolonial thinking and doing in social work requires us to critique colonialism in Canada. This means analyzing the social, political, and economic incentives behind, for example, the slaughter of the buffalo, the killing of Inuit sled dogs, and the residential school system." So again, depending on if you're Indigenous or if you're a settler, there's different sort of paths of movement and different forms of confinement that are represented in these textbooks. Where do I want to end? I'll end here. This will be my last one. So this is a really classic strategy. So this is from the left textbook, and this is the introductory chapter, and this is the start of the chapter. And so the quote that's up on the slide is actually from this little red box down here. And it says, "Social workers are laying the foundations of the civilization of the future." And the quote comes from the English social reformer Egantine Jeb, I can't say that, who was the founder of Save the Children. So this quote's from about 100 years ago. This textbook is about 20 years old. And then somebody, probably actually not the authors, it was probably actually the publishing company who chooses the photos, decided to put the sort of the face of the future of Canada as a racialized face. So there's a kind of ventriloquizing of 100-year-old progress, like colonial progress narrative, through a 20-year-old imaginary, because the guy that wrote this textbook is now retired, with the so-called new face of Canada in this kind of story of progress and civilization. So there's a kind of weaving together of different forms of imaginaries that came from very particular people in very particular times and places. That anyway, it's an interesting strategy. It's very common in Canada, this kind of putting the so-called new face on a very old and often quite traditional ideas. Anyway, so I'll end it there, just to say that we have a lot more work to do to think about place and land, especially in Canada, and how we represent some of the sort of the geopolitics and the imagined geographies of this. So I'll end it there.